If I told you what we were going to be talking about today, you might be tempted to just turn off the video. So let me put it this way. We're going to talk about the D word. For many of us, it reminds us of bad memories. And we have a misconception and a misdefinition and how the D word impacts our lives as Christians and our attitude towards it. The title today, Don't Refuse the D word. And we'll talk about that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Dustin Louie. Dustin is sitting in for our good friend Jerry Duckett, who has been diagnosed with cancer. Jerry has done the first 11 chapters of the book of Hebrews, and with the chemo and the radiation, he's just not feeling up to finishing. So we've gone to our A-list bench, and Dustin has agreed to sit in and join us for Bible Study with Friends. Today, we're going to be talking about the 12th chapter of the book of Hebrews. This is a very interesting chapter because the first 10 chapters are establishing the fact that we have a better relationship and better covenant. Jesus is better than the prophets. He's better than the angels. He's better than the priests. He's a better sacrifice than any of the Old Testament sacrifices. And we have a better covenant over the covenant of the Old Testament. And then in chapter 11, it leads into a description of faith as exampled out of people in the Old Testament. We saw that all through the 11th chapter of by faith, people lived their lives and were pleasing to God. And now we're going to see a continuation of that with the first word in chapter 12 is therefore. Now, when you come to therefore, Dustin, we have to find out what it's there for. Okay? Or ask ourselves the question, what is there for? And this is like saying, in light of chapter 11, all the examples we've just seen, we see here that word therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, when you see, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, what is it talking about?
He's talking about the fathers of the faith, the ones who preceded us.
Exactly. That great cloud of witnesses of all the people that were living by faith. And it says at the end of 11 that these people died without seeing the fulfillment of their faith, but they trusted in advance the way we trust by looking back at the cross. They looked forward to the Messiah. Therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses about living by faith, let us also, and that word also there is this idea of along with them, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily encumbers. Now that's an interesting thing there because every one of the people in the list of faith in chapter 11 committed sin. And they all learn this lesson that sin is an encumbrance to living by faith. So it's basically saying, let us learn from them and also lay aside every encumbrance and let us run with endurance.
Endurance, willing to bear patiently something in light of what you're hoping to achieve.
Exactly. Now, when you run across a word like that in a verse, you want to go to a tool to just clarify what it means for you. And I use the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And I went down here and wrote the definition of endurance is to remain firm under suffering without yielding. To remain firm in our faith, even while suffering, and don't yield. And that's what it's talking about. And run with endurance the race that is set before us, the lives that is set before us by the Lord. Now, if we ask ourselves, how do I run that race with endurance? That is in verse 2. Read verse 2 for us.
Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and hath sat down at the right hand of the throne.
All right. So the answer to the question, how do we run that race with endurance, is the first part of that verse where it says, we fix our eyes on the Lord. If you're running a wrong race, you're looking down at the finish line and you're saying, I'm going to keep my eyes on the prize. I'm going to keep my eyes on the finishing line. And that's keeping our eyes on Jesus. It's one of my favorite verses in Second Chronicles, chapter 20, verse 12, is talking about Jehoshaphat when he's surrounded by enemies. And he says, Lord, would you help me? I'm surrounded by enemies and I don't know what to do, but my eyes are on you. And so here, this key to living this life of endurance is let's keep our eyes on Jesus and run the race of life as if we would run by faith. Verse 3, because that word for, this idea of running a race with our eyes on Jesus. Why should we keep our eyes on Jesus? Because we need to consider him. Think about Jesus.
Yeah.
And the fact that he endured, like we are supposed to endure, such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So this idea that we need to keep our eyes on Jesus and consider him, think about him. I looked up, right up here, I've got a note from the Bible Knowledge Commentary that says, nothing is more natural for a person than to overestimate the severity of his trials and say something like, no one has ever suffered as I do. But we need to consider the fact that Jesus has suffered so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we do not grow weary and lose heart in that race of endurance because we keep our eyes on Jesus, who has suffered worse than we have. In fact, he says, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. He's talking to live people in the book of Hebrews, right? And he says, you guys have it hard, but you haven't died yet. So this idea that he's saying life hasn't killed you yet, so be strong in the race.
Right. You shouldn't give up because basically you haven't died yet. That would be the time where you're done. You're finished once you die, but like until that point, keep persevering and
Yeah.
be willing to continue the sacrifice. Yeah.
Exactly right. And this idea that you go in and say, I want to run with endurance by faith, like all these other people in 11, by keeping my eyes on Jesus, because he has gone through much worse than I have. So I'm going to be able to run that race of endurance because it says, hey, you're still running the race. You're not dead yet. So keep running the race and be strong. Now, he goes into a section, and there's an interesting section here from verse 5 on down that we're going to see a repeated word. You see it in purple?
Discipline.
This discipline. It's used in the next few verses. Discipline is used over and over again in the context of running the race of endurance. Read verse 5 and 6. Read those two verses, and let's look at what we should not be forgetting in our race of life.
And you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives.
All right, now, we have a tendency to take the word discipline and react negatively to it. In modern vernacular, Dustin, when somebody says, your dad is going to discipline you, what does that bring to mind?
They're about to spank you or...
The modern vernacular of discipline is punishment.
Yeah.
you're being punished for something. But that's not what the Greek word means.
Yeah.
In fact, let's go back here. I'll show you some notes here. The Greek word for discipline is education. In fact,
Mm.
looking back up at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, says that discipline means training that corrects, molds, or perfects. It doesn't say anything about punishing. That has become a modern thing.
Mm.
But the word really means to train. And you train them, you do spank them if you need to. In fact, it says there, he who scourges his son, and that word scourges means whip into shape, okay? And he says, don't lightly regard the discipline of the Lord. That's a quote. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. That's a quote out of Job. And it's also a quote in Proverbs. So this idea of to run the race with endurance, we should not regard lightly the training that comes from the Lord. Now,
Right.
read from 7 down to verse 10, and I'll follow along with you.
If for discipline that you endure, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you were without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons.
That illegitimate children is you're not really a child of God. You're just a crybaby. Okay.
Right.
This idea of I'm going to follow the Lord as long as everything is good, as long as he doesn't ask me to do anything I don't want to do, as long as I'm comfortable, I'll be happy to follow him. And if
Right.
we have that attitude and say, I'll go through life, and I'll say, the Lord is blessing my life and everything is great. But if he asks me to do anything hard, if he
Yeah.
disciplines me to train me, that's what an illegitimate child does. That's what it's talking about here in the context of discipline. Now let's go back. Keep reading.
Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplined us for our good, so that we may share holiness.
Up in verse 9, it starts about our earthly parents, right?
Mm.
That's our physical parents, our fathers here on earth. And they disciple us, and we respected them because they were trying to help us be better. Then how much more should we rather subject to the Father of spirits? God disciplines us spiritually so that we can live a better spiritual life. All right. And they disciplined us for a short time, they being the earthly fathers, and it as seemed best to them. But he, capital H, he disciplines us for our good so that we may share in his holiness. So this idea of God's got a plan for disciplining our lives, and that plan is to train us to run a better race by faith. You see how it
Yeah.
ties in? So in that section you read, we see the discipline as a noun. It's a thing to be understood, and as a verb. It is a thing that happens to us,
Yeah.
and it is a thing that we should not resent. And he's going to get to that in
Mm.
just a minute here.
I like how you made a distinction now between it doesn't necessarily mean punishment. It means training.
That's right. That's
So
right.
it's not
This-
like when we receive discipline, we don't have to think, oh, he's punishing me for some sin or something like that. That's
This is-
important.
This would be like an athlete has to be disciplined to be a good athlete. A discipline
Right.
isn't that he goes down to the practice field and the coach punishes him. It's just that he goes through a difficult endurance in his practice so that he is a better athlete. And
Right.
God does that to us. He trains us through hard times so that we're better. Now, then we get to verse 11.
All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields peaceful fruit of righteousness.
All right. So
They're
it seems like it's going to be not fun,
right,
but you go through the discipline so that you get the joy of being a better, stronger Christian. And on the spiritual realm, you do it because it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness by being trained and disciplined as a Christian. And then the first word in verse 12, again, second time in this chapter, therefore. So, in light of the fact of discipline, in light of the fact that God is training you to be a better, stronger Christian to endure that race of faith, therefore, verse 12, we need to strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble. And then it says, make straight paths for your feet so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. You're going to run your discipline in as straight as you can. You're not going to abuse that ankle
right,
until it no longer is lame.
right,
So it's basically saying we're accepting discipline of the Lord and running the race of faith. If we're weak in certain areas, don't overdo. Don't go
right.
crazy. Don't beat
Mm.
yourself up, but run the race until you're strong enough to run the race
And run the race in such a way that you'll be able to finish the race.
and not be hurt worse. And sometimes when we're disciplined by the Lord, we're trained by Him. We don't like it. It's not fun. So therefore, we react negatively to that. And that's where he's going in this chapter. Let's go on. From verse 16 down to verse 21, he's giving us examples of people that didn't trust, that didn't
Mm.
accept the discipline, the training of the Lord. This idea of these are examples of immoral, godless, fearful people who distrusted God and feared. All right.
Mm.
Now, let's just read 16 through 21 as examples of what not to do.
That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, so he sought for it with tears. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, into a blazing fire, into darkness and gloom and whirlwind, into the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words which sound words, such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken.
All right. I'm going to
They,
say now, the earlier verse talked about Esau, who basically sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. But
right,
here is talking about this blazing fire and darkness and gloom and whirlwind, the blast of the trumpet and the sound of the word in verse 19. And they begged that no further word be spoken to them. This is the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And God said, don't even go near the mountain because if you do, you'll get killed. Because I'm doing something amazing on the mountain and you're going to hear my voice.
Mhm.
And that voice was so terrible that they said, oh man, if we hear God's voice, it'll kill us. So we volunteer Moses to go hear his voice. So if anybody's going to die here, we volunteer Moses to die. See? So this is an example of no faith. They feared the Lord. So
Right.
anyway, they feared this command in verse 20. They feared this command and read 20 through 22, and I will not interrupt you.
For they cannot bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, to heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels.
The General Assembly and the Church of the Firstborn. Now, this idea of,
Mhm.
but you have come to Mount Zion, and the last 10 chapters up to chapter 11 talked about you have come to a better covenant. You've come to
Yeah,
a better understanding of a better Savior. You don't need to be afraid, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the New Jerusalem, and you are part of the General Assembly of the Church of the Firstborn, right?
We haven't come to the mountain that brings the law, which brings condemnation. We've come to the mountain of Zion, which brings Jesus Christ crucified and raised, which brings
Exactly.
grace.
And that
Mm,
mountain of the commands was a mountain that brought fear, but
mm,
we are partakers of the mountain of Zion, which is a mountain of grace of the
yeah,
new covenant. So there's no
yeah,
fear for us.
right.
Now we see the finish of that verse 23 is that we're part of that heavenly Mount Zion, and we're enrolled in heaven to God, and we're enrolled to the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous. Now, the spirits of the righteous are all those people in chapter 11, all those witnesses that showed us how to run the race. And we are enrolled in heaven with those spirits of the righteous who have been made mature. That word perfect just means mature. Now, Hebrews has given us 4 warnings up to this point. This is the 5th and last warning in the book. And it's a warning about refusing the discipline of the Lord. The title for this video was Don't Refuse the D Word. Now,
Mm.
we're going to read here, and the warning is verse 25, where it says, See to it.
See to it that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if those who did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape, turn away from him who warned from heaven. And his voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. This expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken, as of created things, so that those things which cannot be shaken may remain.
Now,
Yep.
just wait a second. Up that we're going to get to the third therefore in the chapter here. But he says, the warning is see to it that you do not refuse. Don't refuse this discipline that trains you to run your race of endurance, your life of endurance by faith, just like they
Yeah.
did. So do not refuse to be trained. If God trained on earth these people who reacted fearfully, how much more is he training you from heaven with the better covenant that we have? You of the better covenant, see
Mm.
to it that you don't refuse God's discipline. So you need to ask yourself the question, am I refusing to be trained by the Lord? Am I refusing to go through things that may not be fun, but they're part of being trained? It's like an athlete. Practice is not fun. Playing the
Right.
game is fun. I'm not going to refuse to practice and then go into the game and play lousy.
If you refuse to practice, the coach will bench you. You won't get to play the game. But if you
Exactly.
want to play the game, you have to submit to the practice. In the same way of thinking about like something gold, like a blacksmith. It's like if you refuse to put it through the fire of testing and purification, it can't come out and become what you're wanting it to be. The same way, if you're wanting to be refined, you have to go through the fire.
If you took gold that wasn't refined and tried to make a piece of jewelry out of it, it would be weak. It would crumble. But taken through the fire of discipline, not the punishment, but the training of discipline makes you stronger. And that's his warning here is, hey, we need to run a race of endurance. And to do that, we need to be trained. And God is willing and able to train us and wants to train us for our good. So do not refuse that training. And we
Mm.
ask ourselves a hard question. Do I rebel? Do I refuse the discipline of the Lord? And if I do, look what it says. Therefore, verse 28, the last 2 verses. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, God disciplines us to take things out of our lives that can be shaken, but we have a kingdom that can't be shaken. So let us show gratitude for that discipline by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, because God is a consuming fire. That idea of discipline is a consuming fire that, like you were talking about, takes the impurities out of our life. So we
Yeah.
need to show gratitude, and that gratitude, there's a wonderful little phrase. We may offer an acceptable service. Now, I want my life to be acceptable to the Lord. I want to run a race in my life that's acceptable to Him. And how do I do that? I do that by not refusing His discipline to be trained so that I can run a race of endurance. Running the race of endurance brings us to a life of gratitude and a life that is acceptable to Him. And that's
Yeah.
what I want to do. Be careful not to refuse His discipline, but accept it with gratitude and say, I want to run the race that He's trained me to run. That's the Christian life. Today, we've been talking about discipline, not turning our back on the discipline, the training, the teaching, the molding that God is doing in our lives to make us stronger Christians, to make us able to run the race with endurance. And I want to recommend a video to you. It's called The Bible Teaches Us in Afflictions. It's out of Psalm 119, and I think it'll be a blessing to you. And listen, we're going to finish our great study in the book of Hebrews next week. And until then, God bless you.